everyone knows that tomorrow is Remembrance Day, and it's been actually just a little over 100 years since the end of World War I. And during the time of World War I, it was described, matter of fact, this happened in 1914. It was described as the war to end all wars. And then, of course, roughly 25 years later, we found ourselves in World War II. We're right at the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, getting close. And since that time, we have lived comparatively in peace. I realize there's been places that there's been war, but the tragedy of those two wars was so severe that I think it has created a little deterrence, at least in some of our minds. During that time, we've had the ability to live in some level of comfort. I want to just send your mind in that direction for a moment. I want you just to think about how many products are sold to you each week based on the idea of comfort. Think about it. Wrestle around with it in your mind. They pitch it to us all the time. I don't blame them. I'm a comfort creature. You're going to buy a certain car because it's a little more comfortable. How about the furniture you buy? Practical or comfortable? Comfort's good. How about the clothes we wear now? Oh, that's where it really shows up, isn't it? Like jeans, yeah. Yeah, we're not wearing suits. Not unless we have to. Cotton is beautiful. Even our towels. We buy the luxurious towels. They feel so good. Healthcare products, vacations. Comfort is big business. And you know why? Because we've lived in relative peace for about 75 years. And I don't want to make light of any of our soldiers who've served in other conflicts, but in a conflict that has radically altered our existence here in Canada, we've lived in relative peace. And we're grateful for that. And we're going to talk about that today. We're in a series on the Gospel of Mark. And we've gone through the Gospel of Mark for a long period of time, and we're in a section in that series on the warnings of Jesus and the 4 warnings that he's given. We've covered 2 already, and Jesus has warned them, be careful to watch out for the leaven, that small amount of something that will ruin the whole thing. And that first leaven of the Pharisees was the desire always to see more of God. He needs to prove himself to me versus I need to prove myself to God. He needs to keep showing me more and more and more. And the antidote for that, if you remember, we talked about was, remember what God has already done for you. Keep calling it to memory. If you do, you will actually not miss what God is doing now in your life. Because that's the biggest problem. We miss what God is presently doing. Not that he's not doing anything, we just don't see it. Because we've forgotten what he's already done. The second one, the warning, was the preference about caring, really caring about God, or only pretending, the pretense of caring about God. Which is it? Am I going to look right, or am I going to be right? Which one's really deep in my heart? And all of that, the antidote for that really started in a deep love for God first. And then letting that usher out into a love for people. And that's the reason why we've been talking about this great God. Because we believe the more we think about God and his greatness and what he's already done for us, the more we are going to naturally love him. Much like if you have someone in your life and you ignore every good thing they do for you in your life, and the only thing you ever notice is when they mess up or they don't do exactly what you want to do, how long before you don't even like that person? Doesn't take you any time at all. Same thing with God. Focus in on what God's already been doing. See what he's doing now. You'll love him more. Well, that sends us into the next section. Matter of fact, if you're following with us in this series, we just finished up last week in chapter 12. We're in chapter 13 this week, following right into verse 1 of chapter 13. Here we go. And as he came out of the temple, speaking of Jesus, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." Very interesting passage of Scripture. It's actually fairly innocent. Nothing, just kind of a random statement. He just saw the grandeur and went, wow, look how beautiful this temple building is. And it was. Matter of fact, the reason he mentioned the stones is because the stones were immense. And Herod had begun sometime before this moment. Matter of fact, the temple had been going on, reconstruction of the temple had been going on for about 50 years. And at this point in Jesus, when Jesus has just walked out, it had been so expanded that the Temple Mount itself could have housed 12 football fields, 35 acres. Think that through. That's a big place. One stone that was found of the Temple Mound was 42 feet long, 11 feet high, and 14 feet deep, and weighed over 1 million pounds. Now, I've never seen a stone like that. Matter of fact, it is one of the largest stones that's actually recorded in human history, and they've actually found it. Josephus recorded it. He actually recorded that there's a bigger stone that they haven't found that one. And you think to yourself, how in the world did they get that stone there? I don't know if you know this, but Jerusalem is uphill no matter where you're coming from. That's the reason they built it there. And I'm just thinking about how in the world did they get this 1 million pound stone in place? So you can imagine the disciples looking at this and going, look at that stone. This is impressive. The temple itself, the main temple building, rose to a height of 50 meters. It was a collage of gold and silver and crimson and purple. It radiated the rising sun, and people said it looked like a snow cloud mountain when it shimmered in the sun. So you can understand the disciples' sense of looking at this and going, man, this is gorgeous. Many people believed it to be the most beautiful building at that moment in history. And the reason why it was able to be done, because it was a time of peace, relative peace, and prosperity. And it was Herod's dream to be remembered, build a monument to himself. And for many of them, it was more than just a building. It was more than just a temple mount. It was a fortress, and it represented the security and comfort of the time. As long as that was there, there was a sense of everything was going to be okay. It was the treasury. It's where the money was. It was all going to be good. And the disciples are coming out going, look at this. Life is good. And into this, Jesus speaks in verse 2. And Jesus said to them, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Wow. Okay. Didn't see that coming. Guys, newsflash, this is all going to end. What you think is impossible, what seems impossible, is actually going to change. These massive stones are not going to remain. And the comfortable life that this represents will evaporate. And it does. Matter of fact, just a few years later, by 70, it's done. This whole building is destroyed. And it raises the question, could our comfortable life ever be altered? And I want you to really wrestle around with this morning, because this is not a sermon you're going to hear very often. Matter of fact, I can't remember the last time I actually preached on this passage or the corresponding passage in Matthew. It's a passage that we need to kind of put in the back of our minds. You may need to pull it out sometime in the future and go, oh, I remember when we talked about. What would it be like if everything changed? If our comfortable life, our cars, our chairs, our clothes, all changed, and all of a sudden it was a lot less comfortable in our world. Jesus goes on in Mark chapter 13, verse 3 and 4, and he gets asked questions from his inner circle. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, they could see this massive building structure from where they were sitting on the Mount of Olives. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? When was this going to take place? When was the temple going to be destroyed? And what were the signs kind of pointing to that so that we would know that we're about there? In their minds, they can't think of a way in which the destruction of the temple doesn't represent the end of the world. It raises the question for you and I. Do we believe that all the evil has been removed from the earth that have caused war in the past? Are we assuming that's the case, that somehow, because of all the tragedy that took place in the previous 2 world wars, that we would never go down that path again? What do you think? Well, the person who coined the term, the war to end all wars, was a gentleman by the name of H.G. Wells. He wrote an article, and the title of the article was The War That Will End War. And he wrote this. He said this is already the vastest war in history. This was World War I, 1914 at the beginning. This is not a war of nations, but of mankind. It is a war to exercise a world madness and to end an age. For this is now a war for peace. It aims straight at disarmament. It aims at settlement that shall stop this sort of thing forever. Every soldier who fights against Germany now is a crusader against war. This is the greatest of all wars. This is not just another war. This is the last war. He was a British author. He was a utopian author, apparently. And many people in Britain, Canada, and the U.S. bought into this idea that if we went and fought this war is so horrible, it will never happen again. And it didn't stop war, did it? Because the problem is people. People. The reality is for us today, we even now have greater capacity than ever for destruction. In some ways, that has helped us not to get started too deep into war because of the fear that it would never end. We would just destroy ourselves. So it raises the question for you and I today, is the comfort life that we have right now assured forever? I want you to prepare your heart for an answer that's uncomfortable, that maybe no. Maybe it will be different. In Mark chapter 13, he goes on, and he begins to give them one of 2 warnings in this section that we're going to look through today. And Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. The word see there is the word watch, be careful, be on guard. Not just make sure it happens, but be diligent. It's an imperative. Watch that no one leads you astray. In moments of tragedy, suffering, when our comfortable world is turned upside down, it is very easy to be led astray. This single phrase that Jesus gives here challenges the disciples' worldview. They had thought that the destruction of the temple would be the end of the world or the end of time. 70 AD till today, kind of missed the timing. But what this statement of Jesus actually teaches is this very simple truth that still applies to you and I. Times of suffering are inevitable. Times of suffering are inevitable. If you read through what Jesus is saying here, don't get too used to comfort because it's fleeting. Jesus points out in the course of human history that will be littered with terrible moments of self-inflicted suffering. That which we bring upon ourselves. Not that which God brings upon us, but that which we bring upon ourselves. And then he describes it as birth pains. Just the beginning. That's not the end. See, their mind was it was going to be comfortable right to the very end. And they wanted to kind of know when the end was. So maybe they could get kind of through that suffering part and that would be it. But that's just the opposite of what Jesus says. No, he said suffering is not a sign of the end in it of itself. Matter of fact, that will be ongoing. Mankind forgets easily past pain. And we inflict it upon ourselves again and again. That is the story of human history. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, why did I come to church today? Surely there's some good news in this, and there is. But every once in a while we need to look carefully at where we are and where we might end up being. Jesus is telling them and telling us that war and conflict will never be enough to point out when the final point comes. Because we just keep doing it. We don't learn our lessons too well. And I'm just going to ask you right now, do you think the world is an angrier place than it has been in the recent past? I do. Just read people's comments on YouTube, on social media, and there's a deep kind of seething anger, usually along political divide. What Jesus is telling them is enjoy the comfortable times, but don't be surprised when they end. This morning, if you get in your car and it's really nice and comfortable and you're going to drive home, I want you to go, man, I am glad we're in this time. I'm glad we get to live in this moment of peace and prosperity. But I also know this may not be like this forever. So don't be shaken, Jesus is saying, when these time end and we're pressed into another time that's a little less comfortable. And in these moments, Jesus is saying, don't be led away spiritually by people who run around and go, oh, Jesus is over here, he's come here, and the end is near every time a war takes place. My grandfather, who was a great man, loved God. He was convinced that World War II was it and that Jesus was coming back. He actually fought in World War I and was just absolutely certain that that represented the end. Understandably, there had never been anything quite like it. I can understand why he saw that and went, this has got to be it. And Jesus' word says, you're not going to know. That's not the important part. The important part is how do we live through the suffering? And that's where we want to watch out today. He goes on, Jesus does, in the next passage. It says this, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines, but these are the beginnings of birth pains. And so, no matter what the kind of suffering it is, whether it's political or military or even just kind of natural disaster that causes suffering, it in of itself is not the cue. Well, this must be the last moment of suffering. So how do we live through it? In Mark chapter 13, verse 9 and 10, here's where Jesus begins to tell us how to live through it. Once again, another, be on your guard, be on the watch. Here's the warning. Here's what he says, for they will deliver you over to councils, you will be beaten in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. The gospel must be proclaimed to all nations. In this second, watch out. Jesus is speaking to his disciples. He's telling them that there's going to be suffering. They're going to be a part of that suffering. They're not going to escape that suffering. And the suffering's very specific for His name. Because of their commitment to Christ, there would be suffering. Persecution presently around the world is immense. We talked a little bit about it last week if you happen to be here from Open Door. And if you're not quite familiar with what's going on around the world, I encourage you just to kind of Google Open Door Ministry. There's several other organizations. It's just kind of keep people apprised of what's going on around the world in suffering. And Jesus says that this can become a reality. And it is for many people today. But the point behind that is that suffering can have a purpose. And in this particular passage, one of the purposes that Jesus lists is so that His name would be known, that the gospel would be proclaimed to all the nations. Matter of fact, the four guys that Jesus is speaking to in that moment, some of those become the greatest evangelists, and particularly Peter. When we think about Peter, there's evidence that he stood before Caesar and shared the gospel with him alongside Paul. All over the world, it's still happening. And the reality is that often persecution follows where the church is growing. If you're thinking to yourself, well, we don't really face persecution here very much, there's probably a reason, because the church is not growing. Sometimes the church grows and there's persecution. Sometimes there's persecution, the church grows. Matter of fact, in 197 AD, Tertullian quotes this or wrote this phrase, said this, that the blood of the martyrs is the seeds of the church. Meaning that was the way in which, in his day and time in North Africa, that's the way the church was growing. They saw the way that Christians were mistreated, judged harshly, and yet were loving in the middle of that. They saw purpose in their suffering to follow Christ and to exalt His name and to share the gospel. And because of that, the church grew. Mark chapter 13, verse 11. And I think here's the really good news about any suffering, not just persecution, but just suffering in general. A passage that I think will help all of us and give us some good news today. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say. But whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. If you're a Christ follower today and you're thinking, I hope I never really need to know that information. Well, I'm going to be honest with you, I hope so too. I'm not a guy who's looking to find persecution and track it down. But mark this in the back of your mind, put it in your memory bank, should you ever get there. And you're thinking, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know what the right thing to do is. This is the truth that helps us in all of life. That God, in the person of Jesus, is there in the middle of suffering. In this moment, He's going to give us the right words to say. He's telling His disciples, these four guys in relation to the rest of Christians who suffer later on, don't worry. In that moment, I'm going to be there in a unique way. I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you the words to say. I will be there. And I think the way that we can apply this is not just the time of persecution, but just suffering in general. This morning, we don't face that persecution. And I'm going to be honest with you, part of the reason why is we can look back to the people that we're going to celebrate tomorrow and honor them and their desire to give their lives for our spiritual, religious freedom that we have. And we're thankful for that. But that we still have suffering Each and every one in this room, from time to time, gets moved out of our world of comfort. We get pushed out of the easy chair of life into a moment of suffering. And here's the truth I want you to hold on to completely just about suffering. What Jesus is teaching his disciples, in that moment of suffering, it is not a sign that God has abandoned you, given up on you. It's just the reality of a broken world. Suffering happens. Sometimes it's self-inflicted, sometimes it's just the result of sin. It can even be a time of trial for our faith. Suffering happens. But here's the point, in the middle of that suffering, God has not abandoned you. When we get pushed away from our comfort into suffering and pain, God is there to meet us and be there with us. This morning I want to encourage you, while we're not going to face persecution today, you may be in suffering at this moment. And we're going to pray for you that you will be able to find God, hear His voice, know how to respond to suffering in your life. The worship team's going to come. They're going to lead us in a song about this great God. And Pastor Jay, or Andrew, up front read a passage of Scripture this morning out of the book of Psalms, and I wanted to read a little bit further down in that psalm about the nature of God. This is Psalms 145. It says there, "The Lord is faithful to all His promises and loving to all He has made." That would include us. And then he says these words, and I think it's maybe words for you today. "The Lord upholds all those who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down." This morning, maybe that includes you, that you've fallen. You're hunched over because it's an ongoing battle in life. And this song really teaches us or sings about connecting with God. And it's my hope that in this moment, you'll hear from Him in your suffering.